Hello and welcome to Botched Creative HQ. My name is Gustaf Fjelstrom and I am a 3D motion designer here in the Austin, Texas area. And 3 years ago, after 20 odd years in the digital agency space out in Silicon Valley, I ditched everything and formed Botched Creative, where now I'm concentrating on conceptual designs, style frames, storyboards, and animations for various projects. Thank you to Maxon for inviting me out. I'm very excited to share with you a bit of my process. But before we get into that, let's take the next minute and 29 seconds and we'll take a look at just some of the work that I've done here at Botched Creative. Alright, so today I'd like to break down a recent project that I did with the fine folks over at Pixel Preacher, Jonah. Pixel Preacher makes high quality assets and templates for churches that maybe don't necessarily have those resources, and this project here is a teaching series bumper for the story of Jonah. So think of it as a title sequence for a sermon. So let's take a look at the finished project. So what I've got for you today is we'll do a process overview where I'll give you a high-level summary of the entire process, start to finish. And then we'll do a deep dive on shot number 3, the storm, where I'll jump into Cinema 4D and go over all the gory details as I break down that shot, which will include some rendering in Redshift. Then we'll do a deep dive in After Effects for the comping stage, where I'll be working in an ACES workflow. And we'll have a particular focus on the Red Giant toolset, where I show you my process for bringing my renders to life. So let's take a look at the process overview. I usually break my project down into these 9 buckets most of the time. So ideation, storyboards, style frames, animatic, animation, texture and lighting, rendering, compositing, and finishing touches. So let's just touch on each of these real briefly. In the ideation stage, it took a while to get a hook into the concept behind the story of Jonah. Growing up, I always heard the story of Jonah and the whale, but really wanted to get beyond that and literally bring the story to life. So this storybook come to life idea really became the hook in and of itself into the concept. And my first step in the process is usually putting together a mood board. And I very much like the shotgun approach, where I grab as many images as possible and then whittle them down to a few which represent the core idea, look, and feel that I'm aiming for. This mood board then serves as a guide for the subsequent steps in the process. I collaborated with the client and came up with a basic outline and script, which I then used to create these storyboards. So they start out very simple and crude, and here I'm just trying to get the major story beats down. I then go back and do a refined pass. My background is in illustration, so I relish any opportunity to step away from the computer and do some more freeform image exploration. I created these in Procreate on my iPad, and I find that this process really helps me internalize the story and really gets me in a good headspace to execute the project. Simply put, drawing is fun, so an excuse to do that, and I'll take it. Once I got buy-in from the client, I created a set of style frames to communicate how the final product would look and feel. With my style frames, I try to pack in as much care and detail into them as I can, and I want them to look as if you plucked a single frame out of the final animation. So I don't just slap some stuff together in Photoshop, although that's where I might start. These are all constructed in Cinema 4D, rendered and fully comped in After Effects, as if they were an actual shot. And this actually helps down the road as well, as you'll see later in the presentation. Once the client is on board with the direction of the look and feel, it's time to turn my attention to blocking out the motion and getting the timing right. This process involves building out a rough edit in Adobe Premiere. I start with the storyboards, which gives me a good starting point for shot durations. And then I continue refining the motion and timing using quick viewport renders out of Cinema 4D until I feel like I solved that part of the puzzle. There's a lot of back and forth between Cinema and Premiere at this stage, and using viewport renders is a great way to quickly iterate and try out new things without getting bogged down in all the details. The animation stage is where the real hard work comes in. Based on my viewport renders in the rough cut, I have a basic framework within which to work. But now I have to figure out how to integrate all the detailed movement. This is also where I have to do a fair amount of R&D on things I may not know how to do just yet. It's also when I spend way too much time iterating with X-particles on various simulations and the like. At this stage, it's all about finessing the primary animation and adding in lots of detailed secondary animation. Once I'm satisfied with the animation, it's time to light and texture. Fortunately, a lot of the heavy lifting was accomplished with the style frames, so it's just a matter of building upon that work. I usually work in layers, starting with basic shaders and then progressively enhancing them as I go along. And I'll balance out the shader with lighting, which can have a drastic effect on how the shaders will actually look in the shot. I'll try to keep my lighting relatively simple, imagining how a shot would be lit and filmed in real life. Usually, I add an HDRI image as a starting point, then add a few lights to achieve the look I'm after, accentuating the details where necessary. I'm also constantly doing test renders to gauge render times and quality, working my way up to what is acceptable final render quality, while keeping realistic render times in sight. And speaking of rendering, now that the animation, texturing, and lighting is complete, it's time to let the computer do the work. I'll typically work on setting up these shots during the day and queue them up in the render queue and let them cook overnight. And I'll just repeat that the next day, and the next, and the next, and the next. All told, this project took about 80 to 90 hours of rendering. Once I have my renders out of Cinema 4D, the really fun part starts. I really enjoy taking my renders and pushing and pulling them to accentuate the story I'm trying to tell. I'll combine various render passes, practical elements, specific recipes of image enhancements, and detailed color correction and grading all within an ACES workflow. I'm old enough to have learned basic photography on film, so that's kind of how I tend to approach my digital cinematography, in that I try to get most of the elements in place and feeling good in camera. Then the render is my negative, and from that I can push and pull the look of that image to suit and serve the story. For some final touches on this project, I actually up-resed all the shots by running them through Video Enhance AI. The client requested a 4K delivery, but in this case, rendering everything at 4K would have been prohibitively time-consuming, so we rendered and comped at HD, and then ran everything through Video Enhance AI, which does a fantastic job of upscaling and retaining lots of detail in the image. So then I brought all the up-resed shots back into After Effects to apply some film grain and some final enhancements to all the shots to unify them with a little texture and to impart a slightly more filmic color response. I then rendered out all the shots again and stitched everything together in After Effects, where I applied my typography and sent off my final renders and called it good. So that was the overall process. In reality, sometimes these lines tend to get a little blurry, but in general, this is the way, at least for me, most of the time. So let's now take a deep dive into exactly how some of this was put together. And for that, we're going to focus on shot number 3, the storm. So here is the final shot. We have a little papier-mâché boat bobbing along on some little papier-mâché waves, and the waves were actually the pages of an open book. And this transitions from the water coming out of the book in the opening in the previous shot. We have some real rain, some thunder, and lightning. It's a relatively short shot, 180-ish frames, but we've got a lot going on. So let's dive in, pun intended, and we'll break it down piece by piece. Okay, so here we are in Cinema 4D. I am working now in version 26, but I actually think I produced this in 24 or 25. But that's neither here nor there. So let's just jump in. And we're going to dissect my scene file here, and I'll show you everything that makes up this shot. First, just a few notes on project organization. I straight up stole this scheme from Michael Wrigley's Learn Squared class many years ago. So I have these 3 main nulls, and those contain my lights, camera, and scene. It's pretty self-explanatory what goes in there, so I don't think I need to explain that. So shout out to Michael Wrigley for that. Also, I'm making use of the layers palette. So I have in my scene here most of my prominent elements in their own layers so that I can solo them and turn them off as needed. So I'll be doing that quite often. I'd also like to point out that I don't just have one render scene file. I have multiple scene files that are all rendering different things. They all have identical cameras in them, but I have split out certain elements so that I could render them separately so that I have greater control over them in the composite. And I'll explain that as I go along. Okay, let's start with the book. So I'm just going to solo up that book in my scene file and actually going to jump out of my camera here. So the book was a simple stock model that I purchased from a stock model site. And sometimes the geometry you get from those models leaves a little to be desired. So I ended up cleaning up the geometry a little bit and actually deleting some of the geometry because I needed to make the tops of these pages to be the ocean surface. So I'm going to actually jump into a separate file and show you how I did that. I have these 2 planes that are recreating the geometry of the surface of the topmost pages. And you can see they're very heavily subdivided because I needed to have some pretty dense geometry in there so that the ocean waves would have lots of detail. So how did I go about doing the ocean waves? The ocean waves was actually accomplished using xParticles XP Ocean. And the cool thing about XP Ocean is that you can apply it as a deformer of your geometry. So I have this XP Ocean placed as a child of my pages, and I have just two separate pages here. And that looks great, but not exactly what we needed. So I should point out an alternative way of doing this would be to use a noise displacement as a deformer on your plane, which would have a similar effect, but this is just the tool that I went to for this instance. So as you can see, it's applied my ocean deformation to the entire geometry, which is not exactly what I need. So I needed some way to smooth out the edges of the pages so that it matches up with our original book. So how I did that was through fields. So let me enable these two cylindrical fields. So I placed two cylindrical fields on the pages, and once I enable them, you'll see that it uses those cylindrical fields to smooth out the ocean deformation to the edge of the page. And that is exactly what we're after. So one problem here with this setup is that because the geometry is so dense that we're not getting any playback really. This is going super slow, so it's super heavy on the viewport. So how I got around that was baking this out into an alembic. So I simply selected my page geometry with the XP Oceans and then right-clicked Baked as Alembic. And the result was these files here. I have one for the left page and one for the right page with the animation baked in to this geometry as a self-contained object. And as a bonus, it plays super smooth in the viewport. So I really love baking out alembics wherever I can, just because it makes things easier to deal with down the road. And the cool thing about alembics is that they can still carry over vertex maps and that sort of thing. So yeah, alembics for the win. So another problem I had with this scene was that the scale was completely off. So I had to work at this particular scale because XP Oceans likes to work at a particular scale. And that scale happened to be much, much larger than the scale of my render scene. So the way around that was just to create the geometry at the scale that XP Oceans needed, bake out my alembics, copy and paste those alembics back into my scene, and scale them down to fit back into where they originally came from. And there we have it. Okay, let's jump onto our little boat. So our boat was also a stock model that I purchased, and it's a very low poly model, but that kind of fit the aesthetic I was going after as far as like a little toy, like a little miniature object. So that was fine, but I needed to have it interact with the ocean waves. And I knew I didn't really have time to set up proper dynamics with our waves. So I did the next best thing and used the vibrate tag. So I just applied the vibrate tag to a null that contained the ship. You can see that the access point of the null is placed roughly where the water line is. And all I did was enable a rotation with a very low frequency just to get that bobbing and rotating motion. So that when you pair it with the waves, kind of works. I mean, a little bit, mostly. It's definitely not perfect. You can see there's quite a few intersections in here. But in this case, I decided to fix it in post. All right, another element of the boat is the secondary animation. So for that, I'm just going to turn off the vibrate tag for now, just so we can see the secondary animation. And you can see I have a little bit of wind making the sails flap. So how did I create that? Oddly enough, I used the wind deformer. So if you take a look at my sail geometry here, which I have selected, and I have this wind deformer. So if you were to apply that just to your geometry in general, you can see it's deforming all of the geometry. So that's definitely not what we needed. So I needed to find a way to restrict that deformer to certain points. So the way that I did that was with a point selection. So if I select my sail geometry again, you can see I have these middle points selected. So all of the points that are not attached to the crossbar there. And I have that saved as a point selection using the store selection command. And then in my wind deformer in fields, I just drag and dropped that point selection into the fields. And that way it restricts the motion of the wind deformer to the points that have been selected via the point selection. So that's a real quick, real easy cheat to get some secondary animation in there. And that is also the same way that I got the ropes to get their little bit of movement. Again, point selection with a wind deformer and that point selection dragged into a field. So yeah, pretty quick, cheap, and effective. Okay, let's jump back into our full scene here and jump back into our camera. And let's talk about the backgrounds a little bit. So I needed a background that would tie it together with the previous scene. But I knew that this scene was going to have super shallow depth of field, so it didn't make any sense to put a lot of heavy geometry back there. So, because everything would be out of focus. So I simply rendered out an image of the bookcase from our first scene and then placed that on some cards that I floated in the background. So it looks pretty crude when you're out of the camera, but once you're back in the camera, it's just a way to give some interest in the background and still keep a very low overhead on the scene. So the only other elements in the scene here are my little moon, which is simply a sphere with the moon texture on it. We also have these clouds, which is a VBD sequence, and I just have that loaded up in a volume loader, and that's pointing to a directory of individual files for each frame. So that gives us basically the effect of time-lapse clouds because it's a VBD sequence. Also, we have some dust in the scene as well. I really love adding dust in my scene just to give us some atmospheric perspective in there. And some real subtle motion that really helps, I think, sell the scene a lot. So those are the basic elements in the scene itself. As I mentioned before, I have several other scenes that I use to composite different elements separately. So let's talk about some of those. First, we have the rain pass, which was generated with X particles again. And I didn't want to just have the rain coming down and not hitting anything. So I brought over my relevant geometry. And once again, I had to scale it up. So it was at the proper scale for X particles. And I set the geometry as colliders within X particles. So you can see that I have the rain coming down and then little splashes hitting the surface of the boat and the surface of the water. And then I cached that simulation and then scaled it back down to the correct size for my renderer. So for rendering the rain, I just applied a black non-reflective material to all of my objects in the scene, got rid of any unnecessary objects, and then set up a light that was illuminating only the rain and set that to render. So the net effect was the rain on black, but it still was showing the collisions with the geometry. And once that was rendered out and placed in After Effects, it would line up exactly. And the reason I did that is so that I could have complete control over how that rain is composited with all the other elements in the scene. Another fun little simulation were these boat splashes. And again, because I didn't have proper dynamics between the boat and the ocean waves, I wanted to include some sort of interactivity there. So I set up this emitter using X particles once again, and set it up so that it would blast upwards and bounce off the hull of the ship. But as you can see, it's also colliding with something else. So it's actually my alembic being used as a collider as well. but only on the top surface. So I have the collision set to only be the top of the surface. So I can blast these particles out the bottom, and then they would collide off the hull of the ship and then bounce along the top of the water. And there we go. And again, I just set this up to render a separate pass, just using all black materials, and then set up the particles using redshift point instances, so that when it was rendered, it was only the particles on black. And again, just so I can have complete control over how those get composited in After Effects. Another simulation I had to create was the wave transition effect that opens up the scene. So I have this alembic version that I saved out, which can actually play fairly decently. And that was actually an X particles emitter that I ran through an open VBD mesher and then saved that mesh out as an alembic. So that is my core wave. But in order to give a little bit more life and detail, I'd also use the XP emitter foam, so XP foam. And that just gives us all these extra little particles that will simulate foam, and that just adds a whole lot more life and detail to the wave. So the idea here is that, and let me jump into my camera, is that this wave, so in the first scene, the book opens up and the water sprays out, and this wave is a transition element that gets us from the first scene to the next scene as we do our move, as we do our camera move. So we're really close up on this wave, and then we've got these foam particles that travel with us. And of course, as luck would have it, all that detail gets completely obliterated with the depth of field. So there we go. Once again, these waves and the foam particles were rendered as separate passes so that I could control how they look in the composite. Another fun little simulation that actually ended up on the cutting room floor, it's kind of fun, I'll just show it to you anyway, was I wanted to create this ocean spray that was emanating from the tops of the waves. And for that, I used X particles again, just to emit these tiny little particles along the wave peaks. And that was using a vertex map as an emitter, and just having some subtle wind and some drift there, which I thought was adding a lot, but I think at the end of the day, they just got totally obliterated in the comp, so I chose not to use them, but there's some little fun behind the scenes there for you. Okay, let's jump back to our main scene file, and let's talk about our camera movement here briefly. The camera movement is basically simple. We have a subtle orbit around our boat in our book, and then it was augmented by a whip pan at the beginning as we zoom out, which would match cut the outro of the previous scene. And then we have a whip up as it would match cut to the following scene. So this was done simply by using some nested nulls. Whenever I set up a camera rig, I usually like to set up some nested nulls just so I can control the keyframes separately and not have to worry about messing up my camera keyframes. So let me just pop open the dope sheet and we'll take a look at these keyframes here. So for my camera, the only keyframes I have on the camera is the Z position, so that this is the motion out. So the rotation is actually handled by our null that I've called here camera hub. And that is just a subtle rotation of a couple degrees over the course of the shot. And then the more aggressive movement is handled by another null into which everything else is placed, and that's our whip pan. So that is the more aggressive rotation and the aggressive move out. So this way I keep my keyframes very clean and organized and easy to update and edit. The icing on the cake here was the use of the GSG Gorilla Cam, which lets us add in some organic shake and a little bit of a handheld camera feeling. Now, this was just the tool that I used, but you can achieve similar results with the motion cam built into Cinema 4D. So let's talk about lighting and rendering. And for that, I'm going to switch over to my Redshift view. Let's start up the Redshift render view. First, a couple notes about rendering in ACES. So first note is that I am not actually using the default configuration of the ACES config file that ships with Redshift. So if you go to your render settings, Redshift, globals, you can see that I am pointing to an external configuration file from ACES 1.2. And this is the full configuration file. There's nothing wrong with the one that ships with Redshift, but I find that the full configuration has a few more input-output transforms that I find really helpful. So in my case, I set my rendering color space to ACES, ACES CG, display in ACES, and viewing in Rec 709, which is what my display is set to, and is also what this piece is going out to in the end. So those are the settings that I find work for me. I should point out that I am not an expert in ACES or color for that matter, but I have picked up a few clues, and this is the workflow that has been working for me. So on to the lighting. So as you can see, I have about 9 lights here in my scene. I started with the dome light, but then ended up turning that off once I got all my other lights on, which happens a lot. So I have a couple of cloud lights and a ship light, a down light, a key light, and a couple of moon lights. So the reason I have all these lights split out is because I knew I wanted to have the effect of lightning, and I just didn't want to have a flash frame over the entire frame. I wanted to have the lightning be a little more volumetric as far as casting light on the scene. So I set up the lights for the clouds, and also these lights for the clouds were important because they have a volume contribution right here, which is how we get our VBD to show up. Because in order for the VBD to show up, you have to have a volume material on your VBD, and you have to have lights that are contributing volume to that. So that's how my clouds are showing up. And because I have those isolated as 3 different lights, I'll be able to animate those separately in After Effects. So I've got some cloud lights, I've got some ship lights, and I've got some moonlight. And the key to making this all work was light groups within Redshift. So if I take a look at my lights here, you can see that I have these assigned to their own light groups. So these 2 moonlights, they have the light group of moon. I have a key light group. I have a down light group, a ship light group, and 3 different groups for the clouds. So why did I separate those all out? Well, the power of using light groups is that now I can set those up to render separately. So if I go to my AOV manager, in my beauty pass, you can see that I have all these light groups available. So using light groups in Redshift, you can render those lights as separate passes and then really control how they are combined in the composite. So I'm using a 32-bit EXR render workflow, so I'm able to set up these light groups along with my other AOVs, and then they are all contained in the same EXR image sequence that's being rendered. So another important note about ACES is when you're dealing with any color passes is to uncheck Apply Color Processing. Otherwise, Redshift will bake in the ACES transform into your final renders, which is not at all what you want, because that would defeat the purpose of rendering an ACES CG, and you would lose all that dynamic range and all that color information. Whereas if you uncheck it, it'll just output ACES CG. And once again, when we get to the composite, you will see how important that is. So you can see I've set up a handful of utility mats. And if we go over to the render view, and if we're in bucket mode, then we can see all of the different passes that we're going to be rendering. So this is my beauty pass, and I have my cloud light there, and my second cloud light here, my third cloud light, my down light, my key light, my moonlight, and my ship light. I can also show you the depth map, our emission pass, which is just my background, and the puzzle map, which I rendered just in case I needed to do some corrections on any of the objects in the scene. So those are my AOV passes that I'm rendering. And again, all of those will be contained in the single EXR file sequence. All right, another note about rendering is, let's just take a look at my render settings here. So under the Save tab, you can see I am saving a regular image, which is an 8-bit PNG sRGB, and that will have the ACES color transform baked in. But I'm also saving a multipass image that's an OpenEXR 32-bit multi-layered. So that will have all of my render passes in. And because I unchecked apply color processing, it'll render everything in ACES CG without baking in that ACES transform. So I just wanted to point out here the utility of these naming tokens. So what is this long string in my file path? So naming tokens, if you're not familiar with them, are little bits of code that you can insert that will then populate as data. So you can put in computer name, camera name, date, hour, minute, month, second, year, etc. So, and I actually have this set up in my default file. So anytime I open up a new file, this is already populated in there, so I never have to think about it. But you can put directories in here as well. So I have a renders directory, and then it creates another directory for the project name. And then this creates another directory. If I'm rendering out a sequence, it creates another directory with the year, month, date, hour, minute, and second. And then within that directory, it'll place the file, and I have the file set to the project name, the year, month, date, hour, minute, second, and then which camera I'm rendering. And then if I need to append any other information on that, I can do that. But this all happens automatically. So when it renders, it places it exactly where it should go. So that way, later on down the line, if I'm looking at a render, I can tell exactly what file it came from, when it was created, and where I can find it. And it just makes render wrangling that much easier. So, and I have that same string set up for my EXRs. So just a helpful little tip there, naming tokens for the win. So that pretty much takes care of everything in the scene file as far as Cinema 4D was concerned. So let's go check out our renders in After Effects. Okay, so here we are in After Effects, and here is my main composite file. And just as a reminder, here is where we left off in Cinema 4D. So this is my 8-bit PNG sRGB reference image that we rendered out in tandem with our EXR sequence. So here's where we ended up, and here's where we started. So pretty drastic. Not all comps will be this drastic, but this one turned out to be. So it is what it is. So as I mentioned in the process overview, I very much treat my 3D renders out of Cinema 4D as the negative from which I can print. That is, push and pull the quality of the image to tell the story that I'm trying to tell. And this also allows for flexibility to accommodate for changes without necessarily having to re-render everything. And as for me, it's just plain fun, and that's what it's all about most of the time, in my opinion. So real quick, let's come back to ACES. Let's take a look at why it's a really powerful color management tool to use. So again, I am not an ACES expert, nor am I an expert in color, but I've been able to piece together many clues over the last 9 months or so, and I feel like I have a solid workflow that works for me, but results may vary. So coming out of Cinema 4D, we have our EXR sequence, and I have here in this example comp, this is my beauty pass. I have that actually pre-comped, so let's just take a look at that real quick. So in order to use the EXR correctly, you need to apply the extractor plugin, and this will let you see all of your layers that are in that EXR file. So I've got my beauty pass, and then also my light groups, and then my AOVs. For this instance, I'm just going to use the beauty pass. So that's pre-comped, but it doesn't look quite right yet. It looks dark, and that is okay. So first off, we need to make sure that we are in 32 bits. So After Effects in the project settings, you need to make sure that we're 32 bits per channel. And I actually have my working space set to none. That is, I am turning off the internal color management in After Effects. So under View, use Display Color Management and Simulate Output. Those are grayed out since I do not have a working space set up. So I prefer to set up my profiles manually just to make sure what I'm getting is what I'm getting. So 32 bits, that's very important. So we have our beauty pass and we have our extractor plugin applied to that. So ACES-CG is a linear format, so that's why we need to be in 32-bit. And we also need to tell After Effects how to interpret the ACES-CG footage. And we do that with an adjustment layer and a plugin, OpenColor.io. It's a free plugin, and this lets you decode the ACES color space into a color space that we need. So I just apply the OpenColor.io plugin to an adjustment layer, and then I have this actually looking at the same configuration file that I rendered out with, so the ACES 1.2 configuration file. And in my case here, I have it set to convert. And the input space is ACES-CG. Again, that's what's coming out of Redshift and Cinema 4D. The output space is output Rec 709, because that's what my monitor is, and that's what this is going out to. So that way, when we enable that adjustment layer, we are now back to where we started in Cinema 4D. And to double check that, once again, I have my 8-bit PNG sRGB sequence here. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see we are matching perfectly. Okay, so why? Why did we do all those extra steps just to get back to where we were? So I'm very glad you asked. So what is happening here is that ACES-CG is a very wide color space. So that lets us do certain things that we can't do to a normal 8-bit image. So for instance, I have this exposure adjustment layer, and I have an exposure of here of, let's just say, 6 stops. So if I enable that, you'll see that I am overexposing this by 6 stops, but I still am retaining detail in the highlight information. And you can see in my scopes here, I am not clipping off these highlights. This is because the ACES transform is very efficiently mapping everything out to that Rec 709 color space, because that's what we're viewing. If I were to apply that same 6-stop exposure to our 8-bit PNG sequence without the benefit of ACES, you can see on my scopes, I am completely clipping off all of these highlights, and all of this detail is just completely blown out. No bueno. So in ACES, it outputs all of this information very efficiently, whereas in 8-bit PNG sRGB land, not so much. So that is one of the key advantages to working in ACES. So let me give you another practical example. And for that, we'll just take a quick detour from shot number 3 and we'll go to shot number 1. So this was the opening shot, which you may remember from just a few minutes ago. And it has this bookcase, and we dolly in a little bit on the bookcase. And the shot actually opens up with this nice bokeh effect. And I'm doing the focus in post by just using the Frischlift Lens Care plugin, the FL Out of Focus. So if I throw that on, you can see that in ACES-CG, we retain all of this really nice highlight color information, and this just has this beautiful bokeh effect as I'm increasing the blur radius. So that's what it looks like in ACES. So if we were to apply that same effect to our 8-bit PNG sRGB version, which is what we are seeing here, if I apply that same focus effect, Not so much. So you can see that we just don't have the latitude in that color information that we do have in ACES CG. So that's the sRGB version, and here's the ACES CG version. So that is just another practical example of the power of ACES. Okay, let's jump back to our main comp file and we'll break down how this image was constructed. Okay, so you might remember all of the passes that we had in Cinema 4D. So let's take a look at how we reconstruct those. So starting with my beauty pass, and then here are my lightning passes. And you can see on this layer, I am animating the opacity to bring in the lightning effect. And again, this I'm actually boosting up 15 stops exposure wise, and we're getting way up there, but you can see we're still not clipping. So again, ACES for the win. So jumping into that lightning pass, you can see this is a pre-comp that I have grouped all my lightning passes in, all my light groups in. So here is my ship light. Here's my downlight. Here is my key light and my cloud lighting. And that cloud lighting I've combined in a pre-comp as well. And I have my 3 different cloud lights. And you can see I'm animating the exposure effect on each of those layers in and of themselves. So you can see that we have these lights going off at different times within this comp. And I'm just animating the intensity of the exposure control on each of those lights independently. So that is pre-comped in my ship lighting. And then this entire comp is pre-comped in my main pass here. And then I'm just, again, further animating the opacity of this layer to bring in the lightning strikes semi-randomly. We also have this volume pass, which again was a separate render, and I set all the materials to black and then rendered out a volume pass so that I could comp that into the scene. And that's what that adds to the scene. And because I have that rendered separately, I can dial that up and down as I need it. So here's my dust pass. And then I have a couple passes of rain. And in this case, I was doubling up the X particles rain just so I could accentuate it in certain areas. And you can see here that I am, again, this is on black and it's just the rain. And you can see it's interacting with the surface of the pages and the model there. So when it's composited on, now I have control over the intensity of that. So here's that transition wave that starts off the scene. And as you can see, it was mostly obliterated by the depth of field, but it kind of works in context. And here's our little boat splash. And again, very simple concept, just rendering this on black, and then I have these redshift point instances that's how the particles are being rendered, and then I'm just setting that to add mode on top of my beauty pass, and everything lines up perfectly. In addition to the CG passes, I often like to include layers of practical elements as well, just to give a little more organic feeling and layer in some, just to give a little more organic feeling rather than having just everything come straight out of the computer. So I have several layers of some rain effects. And this one in particular is just some water blobs on the lens. And I have some couple layers of that. And then these are all stock elements that I've purchased over the years. And here's some foreground rain just to augment our X particles rain. And then I have these lens distortion effects from Lens Distortions. And I have some optical flares, which I'm just using to give some lens imperfections and some lens orbs. And it wouldn't be a proper comp without optical flares. I think that's a requirement, actually. So, and then also I'm layering in some smoke elements just to give us some additional atmosphere. And while I'm on the smoke here, let me point out that in ACES CG, if you want to incorporate other assets that are not ACES CG, you have to first convert them into ACES CG. Luckily, the OpenColor IO plugin handles that as well. So for instance, this smoke asset is just a standard RGB element. And you can see I have my OpenColor IO plugin placed on the asset itself. And I have it converting, and the input space is generic sRGB, because that's what this is. And the output space is ACES CG. So that's taking this asset and converting it into ACES CG. So now I can correctly composite it with all my other ACES CG elements. And that you need to do for each asset that's not already in ACES CG. So this is my basic composite with all my passes of CG elements and practical elements. It's time to turn my attention to the color and the color grade. And for that, my go-to is Red Giant. I'm a big fan of the entire Red Giant tool set. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of the tools here for you today. So I usually start with Colorista. And that I usually use to just balance out the exposure and to bring back some of the contrast I may have lost when stacking up all these elements. So in this instance, it's very subtle, but sometimes we'll need to adjust the exposure up or down depending on what I've done all to the comp. And then my primary way of working with color grading is with Magic Bullet Looks. And so let's just pop that open and we'll take a look at Magic Bullet Looks. Okay, so Magic Bullet Looks is really a whole collection of tools, and you just drag and drop them into your tray here. And you can combine them and rearrange them and really configure the look that you want, and then save it out as presets, which I do a fair amount of sometimes. More often than not, I find myself splitting out each tool out to its own adjustment layer so that I can have a finer degree of control in the composite itself. So my first stop was this lens vignette, which just gives us some darkening of the edges away from the center of the screen. And I just really like vignettes in general and how they kind of focus the eye towards the center of the screen. And a lot of the effects that I'm using from here on out are more or less to degrade, quote unquote, the image and to impart a more photographic quality. So while my work isn't necessarily photorealistic, I do like to impart a photographic feel to it as if it had been photographed through a lens. So a lot of what I'm doing from this point on is trying to mimic what the lens is doing. And Magic Bullet Looks is a really powerful tool in that respect. So I also have a glow on here, and in this case I'm using the optical glow, which is a really nice glow. But back to more lens artifact recreations. So I have a layer of lens distortion on here. So if we pop that open, this lens distortion just gives you a little bit of barrel distortion around the edges of the frame. And you can make this as extreme as you want, depending on what kind of effect you're after. But in my case, I just wanted something really subtle around the edges of the frame So, and it works especially nice when the camera's moving, because you get these distorted edges in the movement that looks really cool. I'm also adding in some edge softness, which does exactly like it sounds. It just makes the edges of the frame somewhat soft. And then color-wise, I'm adding a LUT, and adding the LUT also with Magic Bullet looks, because I found in my experience, browsing LUTs can kind of be painful sometimes, especially if they're spread all over your computer somewhere. And I can't remember where I found this trick, but I highly recommend it, is if you spend a little time and then just input your LUTs as their own presets within Magic Bullet Looks, then you can just hover over each of your LUTs and get instant feedback on which LUTs might be working and which ones might not. So in this case, this is the LUT that I chose. And to give you an example of why I have each of these on their own adjustment layer, this LUT in particular, I'm only using at 50% opacity. So if I jump that up to 100, I thought that was a little too extreme. So backing it off to 50 works well. You can see how easy it is to just really dial in with some precision all your adjustments. Another favorite tool of mine for recreating some lens anomalies is chromatic aberration. And that is what happens when the light passes through a lens and the red, green, and blue channels get misaligned. So that's exactly what this plugin does. And it's best when used very subtly. So I'm zooming way in here, and let me just toggle that on and off. So when this comes out of Cinema 4D, all the channels are precisely aligned. So if I were to apply some chromatic aberration to that, it shifts and distorts the blue channel a little bit, and the green channel and the red channel, so that they are misaligned. And this is happening progressively from the center of the image to the edges. So it's a little more extreme at the edges. So subtle is the key here. And it's a very subtle effect, but it goes a long way. And that speaks to all of these effects in general. Usually more subtle is the way to go. And then all of these subtleties add up, and the sum is definitely greater than the parts. And then one of my last steps I usually like to apply after I've done some tweaking to the image is just a layer of pop, just to bring back in some contrast that may have gotten lost in the composite. So you can see here, if I toggle that on and off, I'm just sharpening up these edges just a little bit and increasing the detail in that as well. And then depending on the needs of the scene, I usually like to add in some filmic effects such as diffusion. And for that, I'm going to just duplicate our pop layer. I'm going to name that diffusion. And then I'm going to go into my Magic Bullet Looks again. And I'm going to delete the pop effect there. And I'm going to add in some diffusion. And I'm actually going to add in one of the new tools in the latest version of Magic Bullet Looks, is this optical diffusion, which wasn't actually out at the time that I created this. And I'm very excited about using this tool. And you can see it just gives us some bloom in the highlights, which is very common in lenses as far as how the light travels around in the lens and then basically diffuses the image, hence the optical diffusion. So that's another effect. So again, a lot of these effects are my attempt at recreating real-life camera lens peculiarities, so vignetting, chromatic aberration, diffusion, distortion, and to further that effect, I usually do a couple more steps and actually put these before all of the color grading. So let me just turn that off real quick. And one is actually defocusing the entire image. And in my case, I'm just using the Frischlift Lens Care, but This could be handled with any of the blurs or the camera lens blur. And I'm literally just doing a 0.5 pixel blur on the entire image. And it's very subtle, and I'm just trying to knock down the super sharp edges that come out of CG. And then in tandem with that, I like to use a turbulent displace at really its bare minimum values. So I have this set to 10. I'm going to just crank that up to 20 so we can take a look at that and just crank up the size just a tiny bit just so we can see it on the stream here. But you can see that this turbulent displace is really junking up my edges, as I call it. This is obviously too big for what I would use, so I usually have it dialed into around 10 or 15 in the amount, and then a size of 2, and then bumping up the complexity too, so that very subtly I am just junking up these edges. And when you zoom back out, it's again very subtle, but again, these subtleties stacked up go a long way. So there is where we ended up, and here is where we started. That's quite a departure, but again, I really enjoy this part of the image making process, and this is what I consider my negative, and then this is what I can consider my print. And again, this is just a super fun part of the process to really craft this image. So yes, the Magic Bullet looks and the Red Giant Suite have been completely indispensable to my process. And again, they go on pretty much everything that I create. So again, here's where we started and here's where we ended up. And here again is the final shot. All right, so that is a wrap on shot number 3, the storm. Really happy with how this one came out and how this piece came together as a whole. All told, it took about 5 weeks to put everything together. And the client is super happy, so what more could I ask for? So what did we learn today? I hope you got something out of seeing my process with Cinema 4D, Redshift, and Red Giant, or the Maxon trifecta, as I call it. Those tools definitely make my job a whole lot easier and much more enjoyable, so thank you for that. Okay, thanks for sticking with me in my presentation, and thank you to Matthias and the entire Maxon team for inviting me out. I really enjoyed being able to share just a part of my process with you. And I'm honored to be among such talented and hardworking artists. I've gotten a lot out of these shows myself over the years, so it's great to be able to do my part, and hopefully someone somewhere may have picked up a trick or two. If you'd like to reach out and say hello, you can do so at my website at www.botched.com, but under no circumstances should you inquire about getting onto any plastic surgery reality TV shows. That'll do it for me. My name is Gustaf Fjelstrom, and I'll see you next time.